maybe somebody else out there can. Returning to this bill, because this is some time in coming, I want to first acknowledge the incredible, and I don't use this word very often or lightly, the heroic work of my colleague from Abitibi Bay James, Nunavik, EU, who for much of his life, being a First Nations person, has by his very birthright, but more so by his decision and inclination, fought for the rights of Indigenous peoples in this country, tirelessly, both in Quebec and at the United Nations and around the world. He is one of the leading voices in this country about the rights and responsibilities of government, about the tragedy and the multitude of errors and racist legislation and policy that has emanated from this exact place, from this room, for generations against the First Peoples of this country. My colleague has been determined, he has been incredibly articulate, and it is his opinion, along with the people who first brought this case, upon whom I will rely this afternoon in terms of my concerns for this bill, S-3. Not only my colleague from Abitibi James Bay, Nunavik EU, is opposed to this legislation, so are the proponents, the women warriors lady warriors, who litigated this case for 4 decades, who remain opposed to this legislation. And I will quote their letter to the Minister of Justice. Our reading of the motion introduced by Senator Harder in the Senate on November 8, 2017, that's this motion here, is that we and many other Indigenous women who are similarly situated will not be accorded 6-1A status when Bill S-3 passes. I'll get into what accorded status of 6-1A means, but suffice it to say that the intention of this bill to remedy a racist and sexist policy of the federal government of Canada will not be remedied in full by the passage of this legislation. Nor has the consultation that was promised by this government in arriving here today been done, that the minister herself admitted embarrassment and shame at the lack of consultation that her government promised and her government failed to do. So you can understand why First Nations people, having been through so many experiences of hopes raised, false promises made, to return back to the same old saga again and again, where the federal government, Ottawa, says we're going to get things right, we're going to talk to you and make sure we get it right, and the next thing the government does is nothing. Doesn't talk to them at all, doesn't include them, doesn't bring in their wisdom, and then at the 11th hour, which is true in this case, bring forward a piece of legislation, admit that they didn't consult anybody, admit that that was bad, and then say we're out of time, we need to pass this now. And it's going to do the trick. It's not going to fix the problem in whole. And that's according to the people who first litigated the case. So I trust them more than I trust anybody else. Now, let's start with first principles. The Indian Act, a colonial, racist piece of legislation that was created at the founding of this country, which the Prime Minister himself admits is colonial and racist and sexist in design. That's what we're amending here today. We're amending a racist piece of legislation, a sexist piece of legislation, a colonial piece of legislation to make it slightly better. Not entirely better, not even better for all of the women and their descendants who were affected by its sexism, but just for some of them, only going back to 1951. And anybody who was affected prior to 1951 and their descendants are not touched by this bill at all, will not be deemed into a new status, will not be deemed to be Aboriginal when they are. Only a federal government who says we believe in nation-to-nation dialogue, only a federal government could say that self-determination is important to us. But then when it comes down to the question of who you are, who your identity is, remains in control of that decision and says Ottawa knows best. We'll decide who First Nations is and we'll decide who isn't, which is a continuation here in this bill. So let's walk back, because I think important of how we got here. It wasn't some great government benevolence that said, hey, by the way, this terrible piece of legislation discriminates against First Nations women, which it did and does. Let's find out how. There's two classifications for status, and through the course of this discussion, Madam Speaker, it loathes me to use the words, but the words are applied in law, and these are the words that we have to use because we are talking about the Indian Act. And in the, quote, Indian Act, it describes Indian status. This name and this word that was applied by Europeans to this country, to the First Peoples here, because they thought they were in India. Because they thought that when they left Europe and arrived on our shores here, they were in India, looking for the secret passage to India to enable the spice trade and other things that Europeans at the time were interested in 350, 400 years ago. In 2017, we still use the term Indian in our legislation to describe the First Nations people of this country as Indians. Can you imagine how offensive this is to First Nations people listening to this debate? That First Nations people who continue to live under the Indian Act in the prescription of basic government services, that the rest of the country enjoys without the racist terminology being applied. Could you imagine if non-First Nations Canadians had legislation using racist terminology to describe them? Immigrants from my home country of Ireland, and all the racist epithets that were used against my people for years, that was written into law, and that when I went to apply for medical or dental or education benefits, I had to apply under a terminology of law that was inherently racist against my people? And we continue it. This public secret, we continue to walk with this and say that we are evolving. We have evolved, and acts like this will make it better. And when we ask the government that if you want to do nation-to-nation relationship, if you want to do reconciliation, that when you listen to the current chief of the Assembly of First Nations says time and time again that the Indian Act is a colonial race-based legislation that we must end. We need an exit strategy, as he calls it. The government says, oh, there go the First Nations leaders again. There goes the NDP again saying get rid of the legislation. Of course get rid of the legislation. Who else would survive under this legislation happily? What other ethnic group, particularly a group that was here first since time immemorial, would happily live under legislation that was inherently racist in its design, in its application, and in its use? Would Polish Canadians happily suffer under that? Would Canadians from the Caribbean communities happily suffer under racist legislation in name and application? So, under the Indian Act, Section 6.1 determines that if both parents are of First Nation status, the child will be First Nations. Section 6.2 says that if one person is with status and they have a child by another person who is not First Nations, they will only continue to be First Nations, that child, if the parent was male, if he was the First Nations. But if it was a female, if it was a woman, First Nations, who had a child with a non-First Nations, that child is no longer First Nations, says Section 6.2. That is what is attempting to be addressed today. And that was true up until the 70s and the 80s, where children of First Nations parentage were denied their status under the law because their mom had the audacity to choose who would be her partner. The woman in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s had to make a decision that if she fell in love with somebody who happened to be non-native, that the decision she was actually making to have children by that person was to say that their children could never be First Nations again. They couldn't be a member of their local First Nations in voting. They couldn't be a member of their local First Nations in celebration. They couldn't be a member of their local First Nations in terms of the government programs that were applied to them, to their parents. So that's sexism. If you determine the progeny is determined by whether you're a woman or a man, it's discriminatory. And it wasn't the government that decided to make this change. It was the courts. In this case, the Quebec Superior Court said to the Government of Canada, 2015, all those many years ago, this is discriminatory. This is against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, where you can't discriminate against somebody based on their sex. It took until 2015 for this to be resolved at court, but it wasn't resolved. All the court can do is say, this part of the law is wrong. This part of the law infringes on the rights of Canadians. You have to strike it down. You must replace it with something. That was 2015, August. What did the then federal government do under former Prime Minister Stephen Harper? He appealed. He said, we're going to appeal this. We disagree with the court's findings. We disagree with the idea that you can make a determination of somebody in this country based on their sex. We disagree that it is unconstitutional. We will appeal it. We are going to spend taxpayer money more, because they've spent hundreds of millions over the years fighting Aboriginal rights and title in court. We're going to spend more money from the taxpayers to fight for the principle, according to the former government, that the children of First Nations people should be First Nations or not, depending on the sex of the parent. Okay, so the Quebec court says you must change the law. Canada appeals under the former government. New government comes in, an election, they drop the appeal. The court gives the government of Canada, the courts don't care who the government of Canada is. They don't care which party's running Canada. They say the Crown. Always these terms come back from our past. Oh, the Crown. We are a colonial offshoot. The Crown must remedy this. You have 18 months. That seems reasonable to me. 18 months to go out and consult with people so that if you're going to make the changes to the Indian Act, make them in the most fulsome and proper way possible. Maybe a good idea in those 18 months is if the government of the day went and consulted with the women who first brought forward the case 40 years ago, who are still active. That would have been a good idea. 17 months later, we've got a month to go, and the government pops up with Bill S-3. And amazingly, as they bring forward this legislation, they're challenged on it, because fixes to this act are important, particularly to the people who might be affected. And when the minister who's in charge of this was first commenting on this, this is what she said. The government is also exploring various opportunities and approaches for engagement with First Nations and other Indigenous groups on necessary legislative change, and more information on this will be forthcoming. Sounds good. We're going to consult. A year later, at committee, she's asked, how did the consultations go? And here's the second quote. My department's failure to directly engage with the plaintiffs was not only unacceptable, but embarrassing for me as a minister. So, promise we're going to consult to fix this. A year later, they're embarrassed and call it unacceptable. To my mind, unacceptable means you do not accept something, but clearly it is acceptable, because here's the legislation. And the plaintiffs, the women who fought for this over 4 decades, imagine this personal sacrifice, for 40 years without money and political support, to fight for a principle, for a right, to not be treated unfairly under a racist piece of legislation. They didn't bother to talk to the women who were involved. And those women have come forward and said, as I started this speech with, Bill S-3 does not remedy the problem that we first sought with the courts. So what's going to happen with this legislation? I suspect the Liberals will vote for it. It will get challenged. It will go back to court. It'll start at the lower court. It'll work its way up, probably to the Quebec Superior or the Supreme, with the government of the day spending more taxpayer dollars challenging their version of events. That this change should only go back to 1951, and that's good enough. Accept it. We're going to repeat the errors of history. Now, I can recall when we had an apology to First Nations in this place on behalf of the Government of Canada by then former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And it's important to remember, Madam Speaker, with any of the apologies, the one we saw recently to the LGBTQ community, it's not the Prime Minister himself who's making the apology. It's the Government of Canada. It's the Parliament of Canada expressing regret and begging forgiveness in some cases for the mistakes made by previous governments, whatever their political stripe, because it doesn't matter who was in charge at the time, really. And the apology for the residential school travesty was warmly accepted by First Nations people in the riding that I represent in northwestern British Columbia. Despite years of oppression and oppressive legislation, there was an opening of the hearts of the people that I represent to say, of all the harm being done to us over the many years, we understand that the government now recognizes that as wrong. We accept your apology. And I thought that was broadly true until the then government who made the apology, 2 months later, canceled the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which had been established to help the survivors of residential schools to deal with the trauma of residential schools. What does an apology mean if your next act is to continue the same thing that you were apologizing for? I was recently in a remarkable community in my riding, a place called Bella Coola, excuse me. In Bella Coola, the Health-Sick people have lived there forever. It's an incredible valley, Madam Speaker. It's glaciers and mountains and a massive river that's causing all sorts of concerns with climate change. And the Health-Sick had been living there and growing an incredible culture. And I was on the way into their local school with a local chief counselor and another counselor. And on the way in, there's this plaque, beautiful plaque, great First Nations symbol on the front, and beside it, many names. And the names are of all the residential school survivors from that community, all the children that were taken from their parents over decades, and their names are enshrined in the wall to remind the children as they come in, not taken from their parents, of what happened before. And this chief counselor went to the wall and he said, "There's my name right there. That's me. I was taken when I was 5. And he said, right above me is my mom. She was taken when she was 6. And he said, I only found out that she'd even been to residential school when this plaque was unveiled. And I said, what do you mean? He said, she never talked about it. We never talked about it as a community. The shame was so incredibly great that only when we had this ceremony honoring the victims did I find out my mom had been through the same horror I'd been through. And I said, well, when did you tell your kids? He said, when I was 53, when I was right enough to be able to talk to them. It's hard to understand what the impact is. I think of it as a father having my kids taken, right, by another culture and a government, beaten and raped and oppressed, and the emotions are powerful. When we look at opportunities like this to do away with the continued practice of racist and oppressive legislation, the bare minimum of decency requires that we talk to the people who have been oppressed. The bare minimum of intelligence is to use the wisdom and understanding of those most affected. Bill S-3 didn't do that. The government chose not to do that. They admit embarrassment and shame now. It's not good enough. If you're going to do something and you want to rebuild a relationship, then do it. Do it with integrity. Don't keep issuing apologies and continuing to make things for which you're going to have to apologize again in the future. First Nations deserve better. This country deserves better. Thank you, Madam Speaker.